Jackie Wiessenburger. My name is Jackie Wiessenburger, and I'm a retired educator. I have spent a lot of time both in PK-12 schools as well as in higher ed, and working with kids specifically with disabilities. But even when I was a high school teacher with a general education environment, I was very focused on making sure kids in my class could read. I recall one time a student in my class raised his hand and said, "Well, you gave us reading assignments, but what if you can't read?" And that bothered me very much, which set me on on a path really to learn as much as I can about how best to teach children to read and how best to maximize the learning environment. So that's my background, and maybe some of you I know already, maybe some of you have been in classes I've taught, but again, welcome. So the primary goal of this session is to develop an understanding of the rationale to change reading instruction in Wisconsin. And going across the state, I've heard from many people like, Wisconsin's a great state for education, and I think we're doing pretty well. And so why in the world would the legislature step in and pass a law called Act 20 and interfere with individual districts and different schools in terms of how they teach reading? So I'm going to be presenting some information about Wisconsin's performance over time in reading, as well as some other information about what other states have done to turn around their reading performance. So the title of this particular presentation is called The Case for Act 20. And so in a sense, it'll show the rationale for Act 20 and also the need for change. And I also want to mention to you at this point that there's another, since you've signed up and registered for this session, if you haven't attended the other sessions as a part of this three-part series, I want to encourage you to listen to Professor Emeritus Perry Zirkel, who talked a great deal about legal developments across the country related to dyslexia and the reading legislation that's being passed across the nation. It's quite interesting and very informative. And then I too did another session on Act 20 called The Specifics of Act 20. So if you're interested in knowing the specifics of the law and what schools and school districts are required to do related to the law, please know that you have access to that recorded session. So again, this is the case for Act 20. So one major part of the bill, and it's stated over and over again, is that districts and schools should not continue to use 3Qing, meaning that students should not be taught how to read simply through the strategy of guessing what the word is based on either the meaning of the rest of the sentence or visual cues like pictures or other hints that they get through reading a sentence or a reading passage. So at this point in time, I'd like to demonstrate a very interesting clip that an educational psychologist produced to show how 3Qing is not effective in teaching children how to read.
Hi there. I'm the mom of a first grade student. I've started getting curious about how my child is learning how to read in school. I'm a PhD level behavioral scientist, and I made this video because I'm trying to make sense of some contradictions I see between the well-established science of reading and how kids are actually being taught to read. Here's one thing I'm really confused about. Perhaps you've noticed your child being assigned books according to their just right reading level. These reading levels follow the alphabet like A, B, C, etc. What's strange is that these books often contain words that are pretty hard for a little kid to sound out, such as community or purple. It seems like kids are just supposed to memorize these words. To make it easier, kids are taught tricks for how to guess words when they get stuck. They can, for example, guess a word that makes sense. They can use the picture to guess the word, and they can even just skip the word entirely. Now you might be wondering, can't kids also just use phonics? It's true that phonics is suggested as one of various tools kids can use to figure out a word, but as I hope will become clear over the course of this video, what's actually happening in the early grades is that kids are not learning enough phonics skills to sound out the types of words that show up in the books they are actually reading. Furthermore, the other cue-based strategies, such as guessing from pictures or from context, are, according to experts, actually undermining their ability to read. All of this controversy got me wondering, will my kid learn how to read this way? I decided to do an experiment to find out, using Reading A to Z, also known as Raz Kids. This popular reading app uses books at the just right reading level. So I'm going to show you an online book, but what we learn here should apply to regular books that also use these just right levels. Here's how I did my experiment. First, I had my daughter read a book on Raz Kids. Then I had her read the same story, but this time with the pictures covered. Then I had her read the harder words from the story with no pictures and no context. And finally, I tested these words again the next day to see how much my daughter had learned. So what do you think? Will she learn these new words even though she doesn't have the phonics skills to sound these words out? Let's see what happened.
I ate paint my swing purple. I paint the fence purple.
Yeah, it's amazing how you're reading without even looking at the words.
I paint the door purple.
Great.
Look at all that purple.
Mm-hmm.
I paint my mom purple. Mom doesn't ought not like purple. It paint.
Overall, not too bad, and she's nailing the word purple. Let's see what happens when we take away the pictures.
I put my swig up.
Okay, great.
Up.
Okay.
Paint.
Okay. That's not what I was expecting. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. It doesn't work that way. You can tell she's really thrown off by the lack of pictures. She even forgets momentarily how to sound out words at all. It's a little hard without the picture.
Paint. I like paint the fence.
Good.
purple.
Okay.
I paint
And
the
it disappeared. It's like you can hear it, but it's not. Oh,
door. Purple.
Nice. She's starting to get the hang of it again. She doesn't have pictures to look at, but the sentences are pretty repetitive, so she can kind of figure it out from the context and the pattern.
Mom.
all of a sudden disappeared.
Okay, we're going to stop with that now, but I just wanted to illustrate how many teachers say to me that it seems as though kids are doing pretty well in reading all up until about 3rd or 4th grade. And then the pictures are no longer on the page, and then students start demonstrating difficulty reading. So here's an example of where teachers and parents may believe that their child is learning to read, but in fact, what's happening is they're taking a lot of knowledge from the pictures in front of them and other cues to be able to read the sentences.
Oh,
That is the problem with that as a cognitive psychologist is that your brain is being taught to be distracted from decoding the words and learning how to somehow manage by guessing what the words are. So this is a graph, and I think it's important for you to know that this is something that the legislature is very concerned about. In this graph, you'll notice the line graph goes well over 20 years. Back in 1992, you can see the red line is Wisconsin. And this is the relative ranking of different states over time. You can see that Wisconsin and back in 1992, in terms of ranking compared to other states in the country, was about at the sixth level. They are 6th from the top in terms of the reading performance for 4th graders. Then when you look at the end of the graph for Wisconsin, you can see how we have over time fallen greatly in comparison to other states. If I'm going to move this here so I can look at it too. I can. Anyway, if you look at Florida instead, starting in 1992, the trajectory is much different. The yellow line shows that over time, Florida has outranked us and done better in terms of their 4th grade reading measures. And then if you look at Massachusetts, which is the blue line, they pretty consistently over time has been performing quite well in comparison to other states. So Massachusetts, as you probably are aware, they have a very different demographic compared to Wisconsin. They have many college-educated populace there. And so therefore they, they likely have a lot of socioeconomic and educational support for students who are going to school. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, you'll notice that, we have not fared well in comparison to either Massachusetts or Florida over time. So in 2022, NAEP, which is the National Assessment for Educational Progress, of course, where they sample students out of each state every 2 to 3 years, depending, COVID, I think, goofed things up there for a while. But in 2022, only 33% of Wisconsin 4th graders were assessed as being proficient in reading. So that's less than half by quite a bit. And then 8th graders also, only 32% were considered proficient in reading in 2022. And over time, Wisconsin has had the highest reading achievement gap between white students and Black students in the nation. And this has been true for a couple of decades. And unfortunately, that means that our African American or Black students are really doing poorly. So if you consider that if only a third of our 4th and 8th graders are proficient in reading and our Black students are, the gap is even big for them, you can imagine how poorly they're performing over time on measures of reading. In Wisconsin, Black 4th graders lost 14 points on this particular assessment since 2003, whereas Mississippi's Black 4th graders gained 12 points over that same period of time. And overall, for all Wisconsin children, they've pretty much flatlined in their growth in reading proficiency for 20 years, except for Black and Hispanic students in our state who have lost ground over time. And I want to mention that this is not just a Milwaukee problem or simply a COVID problem. Again, a 20-year problem is not a COVID problem. And it's not just Milwaukee, because other poor children across the state are not performing well. Now, looking at the forward exam, which is our statewide assessment exam for English language arts, 39.2% of Wisconsin students in grades 3 to 8 scored proficient or advanced. So a little bit better than on the NAEP, but it is still less than half by a great deal. That was 2023 data. And then on the ACT, which is the college prep test, in a sense, 40.7% of Wisconsin students in grade 11 scored proficient or advanced, while only 28.5% scored below basic on the ACT in English language arts. So that's pretty abysmal. And again, Wisconsin has the widest achievement gap between African American and white students of all states in the nation. So look at this graph here. The green line here shows the reading proficiency standard at 238 for 4th graders. And then if you look at this is from 2003 to 2023. I wanted to give you a 20-year snapshot of how we've performed over time, or our students have. So the green line represents the reading proficiency standard. The blue line are all students in Wisconsin and how they've performed over time. And the red line are our Black students in Wisconsin. As you can see, over time, our Black students in Wisconsin are performing, we're not making gains, let's put it that way, in terms of reading proficiency or even in closing the achievement gap. Now, these are for Hispanic students. The black line in this case is the reading proficiency standard for 4th graders. The blue line is all students in Wisconsin. And the green line is for those students categorized as or referred to as Hispanic students, or self-identified as Hispanic students. And as you can see, there's a gap there as well. Then let's look at students eligible for free and reduced lunches are the poor students in Wisconsin. As you can see, again, the black line being the reading proficiency standard, the blue line meaning all students in Wisconsin, and the orange line is the all students eligible for free and reduced lunches. So we're not doing well with kids in poverty. Now, this is a graph depicting only 4th grade Black students and state comparisons over time. The blue line represents Florida 4th grade students. The green line represents Mississippi 4th grade students, and the red line represents Wisconsin 4th grade students. As you can see, Florida since 2000, early 2000s, have made significant gains in the reading performance for their Black students. Mississippi has also made substantial gains over time. And then Wisconsin, unfortunately, we've lost ground. Of course, children grow up to be adults. And it's been estimated that as many as 1.5 million Wisconsinites are in help of building their literacy skills because they struggle to understand short, simple sentences. And I could present data on literacy rates and the correlation between literacy rates and incarceration rates, and the correlations are quite strong. Of course, as we all learned in college, correlation does not infer causation, but the correlations are strong enough to suggest that that we're not doing well in terms of preparing our students for productive lives in which people can get jobs and have satisfactory lives. There's a ton of research about the need for change as well. So let's go into a little bit of that. You've probably heard of the National Reading Panel, which was published in the year 2000. And, you know, it's been quite a few years, like over 20, since the National Reading Panel results were published. At that point in time, though, the U.S. Congress in 1997 commissioned a group to evaluate existing quantitative research to determine what are the most effective methods for teaching children to read. Even back in those days, the reading wars were prevalent. The 14-member panel included experts in, reading education, cognitive educational psychology, and education. And they looked at over 100,000 reading studies and evaluated that should read 10,000 reading studies before 1966 were evaluated. And they looked at all this research and they categorized it. And the reason I know more about this than maybe your typical educator, one of my main professors at the University of Minnesota, when I was working on my PhD, was a member of this National Reading Panel. And they categorized all these different research studies into 3 different categories. One category they called gold standard, meaning that there was experimental design research where they had control groups and experimental groups, and then they had what they called silver standards of experimental research, where they were pretty good but not at the gold standard, and then they had categorized another group called bronze research. But they looked explicitly at quantitative research, so they didn't look at anecdotal case studies or qualitative studies. They looked specifically at research studies that produced quantitative results, statistical analysis. At that point in time, they found that there were 5 essential components that were found to have a positive impact on teaching children to read. And these included explicit instruction in phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness, by the way, has nothing to do with the letters on the page. It has everything to do with sounds. And it's the ability of a child to be able to hear, identify, and manipulate small units of sound. They also found that systematic phonics instruction was important. And of course, phonics, as we know it, is the relationship between the letters and the sounds, and the ability to make sense of the written word by using that relationship. In a sense, it's a coding system with letters and groups of letters representing different sounds. Another factor they found to be important is fluency. And there are certain strategies that can be used to improve fluency that they found that would help with that. Now, some people, including those in my own family, say, well, if I read slowly, it's really not that, it's not that important. I'm still a good reader. Well, let me say this, that if you can read with fluency, then your brain gets freed up to spend more time focusing on comprehension. If you are struggling a little bit to decode unfamiliar words, then your brain is more focused on to decode and to use the coding system to figure out what the word is, and less attention can be applied to comprehension. So fluency is quite important for reading comprehension. Also, the reading panel found that vocabulary development is important, that children, just simply learning phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency is not going to achieve reading comprehension, that students need to understand what words mean. And instruction and text comprehension also is important. Now consider that many people mistakenly believe that science of reading is all about phonics, and it truly isn't. It truly means that there are 5 different pillars that are important to reading instruction that have been scientifically verified in the year 2000, but in years subsequent to that. The National Reading Panel also looked at studies about independent silent reading. You may have Drop Everything and Read programs in your schools, but they did some studies on this, and they found that there was no evidence to support the effectiveness of independent silent reading as a means to improve reading performance. Since that time in 2000, other studies have been conducted to look at the effectiveness of silent reading. And for struggling readers, they found that silent reading is not effective, that struggling readers really actually misuse their time during silent reading periods and truly do not improve. However, studies have found that sustained silent reading can improve attitudes toward reading among skilled readers when they're given the opportunity to choose their materials. So for teachers in classrooms with different levels of students, silent reading can be an instructional method for those that are already skilled, but it's not a useful technique to teach children who are struggling how to read. Okay, other research evidence since the year 2000. Compelling evidence, and this is one study, but there are many others, show that decoding skill and linguistic comprehension account for most of the variance in reading comprehension. In other words, those are the 2 most important aspects for children who are proficient in reading. They need to know how to decode, and they need to know how to understand language. And that's most of the variance in measures of reading comprehension. So we need to teach both. Fluency skills are also considered important. Sometimes you may hear it referred to as automaticity. That's where a child does not stumble when they read, that they can read with fluency, that they can use prosody, and if they can do all of that with fluency, that they can comprehend better. And letter sound skills like decoding skills are important to develop decoding skills, which help both with spelling as well as with reading. A 2016 study, excuse me, I take a drink here. A 2016 study where they looked at a meta-analysis of 56 randomized studies found that all of these factors are important to teach: vocabulary knowledge, segments of speech, how sounds are linked to the print, decoding skills, how to analyze word parts, how to write words, and how to read accurately with fluency. Writing is important, and if you can teach how to decode along with how to spell the same words, you're going to be light years ahead. They've also found that text structure is important. In other words, different components, grammatical components of a sentence or a passage, and it helps facilitate comprehension. I'm going to take a little pause here to go over some definitions. The definitions of science of reading, there are numerous definitions out there, but I want to emphasize that really the science of reading is best described as an ongoing collection of research. In other words, what we know today is not going to be as good as what we know 5 years from now, because we keep doing research studies, we keep collecting evidence, we keep learning more about effective strategies. Evidence-based instruction is often used, and it's supported by intensive empirical research, converging empirical research, rather than subjective case studies or untested theories or unproven theories. And then structured literacy is often used also in the science of reading nomenclature, and it refers to using explicit and systematic teaching of all important components: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary knowledge, and reading comprehension. I worked with a professor once that used to refer to random acts of instruction. Hopefully we're not out there using random acts of instruction, that we're very explicit and systematic in our teaching so that our students become proficient. Okay, let's talk about some real world examples. After going over the research, I think it's important to know, well, you know, researchers are researchers and they have their little studies and they can produce results, but what's really happening out in the real world? Let's talk about the Mississippi Miracle. In the year 2013, Mississippi passed a new reading law. And since that time, Mississippi has gone from being ranked second worst state in the nation to now 21st in the nation in terms of the reading performance for fourth graders. Also, for low-income students in Mississippi, their fourth graders now rank second highest in the country on the NAEP reading exam. They've done a lot to turn around their reading scores in Mississippi. Other southern states have done similar things, but more recently. Louisiana in 2021 passed Act 108. Their law required every K-3 teacher to take a training course in a science of reading, and among other things. And since 2021, and that's not that long a time, they've improved from 42nd in the nation to 11th in the nation in 2022. So we're talking about a very short turnaround in Louisiana. And then Alabama, 2019. They passed their Alabama Literacy Act, and they, very similar to Wisconsin's Act 20, they required teachers to be trained in reading instruction, to progress monitor third graders, assign reading coaches, and summer reading programs for struggling readers. Alabama's low-income fourth graders soared from 49th in 2019 to 27th. So let's look a little bit at this line graph here. And I don't know, if you look at this top line, that is Florida. And you can see that, let me get this out of here, if I can get it. I got something in the way here. Okay, if you look at the top line, which is Florida, you can see that when they passed their first law in 2000, in the early 2000s, they were about here in terms of their rank for low-income students. And then over time, because of the law they passed largely, you can see that look at the trajectory of their students' performance in Florida. Then let's go down to the next, this is the next line, it's a little darker blue. This is Mississippi. You can see here that they started out very low in the nation in the early 2000s. They passed their law in the late 2000 teens, and look what happens. Boom. The low-income kids reading takes a substantial improvement. Same with Louisiana. They passed their law in the 2017 or 2019, and look what happens to them. And then we've got Alabama, similar kind of concept, 2019. They passed their law, and look what happens to their reading scores for low-income students, for fourth graders. Amazing turnarounds in all of those states. So Florida, as I mentioned before, they passed their law in 2001. They entitled it the Just Read Florida law. The bill established reading as a core value in the state at the time. Florida's reading proficiency rank rose from 42nd from the top, in other words, 9th from the bottom in the early 2000s, to 2nd in the nation in the year 2022. Then recently, Florida strengthened their 2001 legislation by including requirements for progress monitoring, low-performing students, requiring the teaching of phonics, and eliminating 3 cueing strategies. So we'll see how they do from here in the future. California. Beginning in 2020, the state established an early literacy support block grant process. And that was in response to a 2017 lawsuit, which argued that the state violated its constitution by not teaching students to read. So in other words, parents and others got together and challenged the state by submitting a lawsuit because of their low performing students. In response to that, the state allocated $50 million in new state funding to eligible schools. The eligible schools were the lowest performing, the 75 lowest performing elementary schools in the state on reading measures. And the grants promoted literacy practice grounded in the science of reading and the development of literacy action plans. A recent study by Stanford University looked at those schools and how they were doing and found out that their scores rose by 0.14 of a standard deviation, which they equated to 25% of a school year of learning, compared to non-eligible schools, or those that didn't receive the funding or the training in science of reading. Now, this is looking at more of a city, an instance where a city implemented science of reading. Baltimore City in Maryland. Now, you may wonder, why am I bringing up Baltimore City? Well, Baltimore City is often compared to Milwaukee. They have very similar demographics in terms of their population, in terms of their median household income, and in many other ways, they're very similar. So I want to talk a little bit about what they've done. So in 2019, pretty recently, Maryland passed their Ready to Read Act. And in that act, students are periodically screened, and identified students receive evidence-based explicit instruction, similar to Act 20. And in 2016, only 14% of Baltimore's elementary students passed their state English language test. And in 2022, Baltimore's elementary school students improved to a 22% pass rate. Yeah, that's not great, but it's better than 14%. So they instead of a superintendent of schools, they call it a CEO. But she said that she believes their focus on phonics and other science-based strategies that, will mean that the gains will continue. So at this time, I'd like to play a little clip from Baltimore City's CEO.
Not where they want to be, but the new statewide MCAT test scores show students in Baltimore City public schools are scoring higher than last year.
And in some cases, higher than before the pandemic. 11 News reporter Tali Taylor joins us now live in the newsroom. And Tali, the highlight is the improvement in English language arts.
Yeah, and at one point during our interview, the city school CEO said that certain test score results are nothing to aspire to. But she also said that the trajectory, the path that city school students are now on, is heading in the right direction.
We know we're not there yet, but if you look, say, 6-7 years ago, we were close to 1 in 10 students in Baltimore City reading and proficiency. We're now at 1 in 4.
The CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, Sonia Santelises, says that 25% reading at proficiency is by no means the goal. But after years of pandemic learning loss, she also says it's important to highlight areas of improvement.
We have about 18 schools that had over 10 or 12 percentage points growth in 1 year.
District-wide, New Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program scores, or MCAP scores, show that 3rd through 8th graders saw improvement in English language arts last spring compared to 2022. Only 10th graders saw a slight decrease. Santelises credits multiple tools, new curricula, federal COVID funds, and tutoring programs for the gains.
Some of the ESSER dollars, for example, really helped in our early grades tutoring. And we were able to see which tutoring programs got us the largest gain.
In math, city school students saw smaller gains, roughly matching the statewide increase of 2 percentage points compared to 2022. With 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and Algebra 1 students testing better, and 6th graders and geometry students seeing decreases. Santelises zeroed in on 2 key areas for improvement.
Fluency in math means you're not stopping to think in 4th grade, what do I do next in this division problem? And what we saw for a lot of our students is that the writing about math was a challenge.
Santelises says math proficiency, more than any other subject, saw significant declines during the pandemic because it's so difficult to teach through a computer screen. In science, 5th graders saw slightly higher test scores, while 8th graders saw slight declines. When asked which student subgroup she was most concerned about, Santelises didn't hesitate.
We still have work to do with our students with disabilities. That's an area that we really need to do a deep dive in. Some of our largest gaps are actually not necessarily the racial gaps. Some of our largest gaps are actually gaps with our students with disabilities.
This is the Palo Alto, California school district. And the reason I chose that as a comparison is that Palo Alto is one of the richest districts in California. However, they began their Every Student Reads initiative, mainly because they were very concerned about marginalized groups within their school district that were not doing well, even though overall their reading achievement was quite good. Again, it's a wealthy district. However, they were concerned about different subgroups within their school district population that were not doing well. So they started this Every Student Reads initiative in 2021, which is an Orton-Gillingham approach to teach foundational reading skills. Orton-Gillingham is one of the early proponents and curricula that that is in line with the science of reading. So after implementing this in 2021, they are happy to report that their Black students had a 33% increase in their 2023 reading scores, again, only 2 years. Hispanic students within the district had a 36% increase. And English language learners grew by 37%. And socioeconomically disadvantaged students improved their reading scores by 30%. So amazing results in only 2 years after implementing science of reading programs. So we can do this, Wisconsin. Our state's motto is not the status quo or good enough. Our state's motto is forward. And if you look over here at our state flag, you'll notice a little word in there. The state motto is forward. And they adopted that in 1851 to reflect the state's continuous drive to be a national leader. So let's build on what we know works and make sure that all of our students, the most that we can achieve reading proficiency. And after all, teaching children to read can change the trajectory of their lives. So here are some potential discussion questions I might have for you, and we can discuss these, or we can just use the remaining time for me to respond to questions. But I think it's good for us to reflect on this. Why does Wisconsin have the largest achievement gap of all states in the nation? You can't argue that our African American students are poorer than Mississippi's Black or African American students. You can't argue that Wisconsin African American students are more disadvantaged than Illinois. Why is it that Wisconsin has the largest achievement gap of all states in the nation? Then, what are the reading proficiency rates at your school? Have you looked into that? How are you doing as a school or in your district? And what barriers to achieving reading proficiency exist in your school? And what can be done? What can you do to remove those barriers? So now I'd like to open it up. I think we have a few minutes here. Not many, but a few. I'll entertain any questions you might have or comments. So please share. Do you know, Nancy, has anyone entered questions in the chat? Let me look up here. My own self.
I'm just looking and don't see any specific questions. The one question is, why did it take so long to get legislation in our state?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it's quite actually kind of discouraging that it that legislation needed to happen before changes could be made. Back in the day when I was getting my PhD in 2003, we often at the University of Minnesota talked about why is it so difficult for the research not to somehow be conveyed to school districts across the country, and why did it take so long? But you'll notice that in every state, or most states that have changed their reading proficiency rates, it's happened as a result of legislation, not just because educators getting together and becoming more acquainted with the research. It's happened in a sense forced upon us to make these changes. And I think I think there are a lot of teachers out there that kind of knew things weren't going as well as they could, and many of them I know would close their doors and teach some of the 5 components of effective reading instruction, and kind of go against the curriculum that was purchased by their district, and kind of keep it on the down low just because they knew it worked. So it is interesting that, yeah, why did it take so long? Why is it a 20-year after the National Reading Panel was published in 2000? Why did it take over 20 years for schools to make these changes? I guess the one exception is Florida, where they passed that their reading law back in the year 2001, and look at how they've performed over time. Any other comments or questions?
The only additional question right now is, do you think that Wisconsin Nice was one of the reasons that teachers did not challenge whole language?
That is a very interesting question. Yes, it is that is a phenomenon I've noticed since I've moved to Wisconsin. Of course, it's been 20 years, so I'm probably Wisconsin nice now. But I do think that people do want to get along and generally respect authority and those they work with, and therefore do not necessarily question the curriculum that's been bought or the advice of maybe some more senior teachers that believe in a different method. But I think we ought, as educators, we ought to be questioning all that we do on a continuous basis. There were things that I did early in my career as an educator that I look back now and I'm ashamed that I participated in. As just one example, back in the year in upper 1970s and early 1980s, it was commonplace to put kids who were acting out into rooms where there was a punching bag if they were aggressive. And they were somehow to punch that bag until they, in a sense, got it out of their system, the aggression out of their system. Well, then we found out after we collected data on those practices that actually what we were doing is teaching a link between anger and punching, which did not serve children in their best interest or society's best interest. So we've done a lot of things in time over education, that things that we thought were right, things that other people said were right, and we trusted them. And maybe Minnesota, I was going to say Minnesota nice. We're in Wisconsin. Wisconsin nice is one of the factors that lead people to not question or to challenge others who are in authority.
Thank you
Be
so much,
interesting to
Jackie.
hear your perception on that.
Do you have any closing remarks? And then I'll stop the recording.
Okay, first of all, I just want to apologize for the technology snafu, and thank you for being so patient. And I hope all of us will do our small part to affect change in our state so that more children can achieve reading proficiency. And thank you so much again for your participation.